The Tet Offensive began on January 30th, 1968, when forces of North Vietnam and the National Liberation Front of South Vietnam launched coordinated attacks against more than 100 cities, towns, and military installations across South Vietnam. The offensive deliberately coincided with the Vietnamese Lunar New Year or Tet, when many South Vietnamese and American forces expected a temporary ceasefire. Military offensive was ultimately repelled. The attackers suffered extremely high casualties and failed to spark the nationwide uprising that they had anticipated. Key battles, such as fighting the Hue and attacks in Saigon, ended with communist forces withdrawing or being defeated after weeks of combat. Despite this tactical defeat, the Tet Offensive became a single major strategic and psychological victory for North Vietnam. Before the offensive, many Americans believed the war was nearing a successful conclusion. The scale and intensity of the attacks contradicted that perception, undermining public confidence in official statements and accelerating opposition to the war within the United States. The consequences were profound. American public support for the war declined sharply, peace negotiations gained momentum, and President Lyndon B. Johnson announced that he would not seek re-election in 1968. Over the following years, the United States shifted towards reducing its direct military involvement through a policy later known as Vietnamization. Part 1. Introduction. The offensive that shook the Vietnam War. By the late 1960s, the Vietnam War had already consumed hundreds of thousands of lives, drawn the United States deeper into Southeast Asia. American commanders, repeatedly assured both their government and the public that victory was approaching. Enemy casualties were high. Major operations had disrupted communist strongholds, and official briefings projected confidence that North Vietnam was losing the initiative. Beneath this optimistic narrative, however, leaders in Hanoi were preparing one of the most ambitious military operations of the 20th century. The communist offensives that erupted during the Vietnamese Lunar New Year in 1968 would challenge almost every assumption held by military planners. Known as the Tet Offensive, it was not simply another battlefield campaign but a coordinated nationwide assault designed to strike cities, military bases, provincial capitals, and symbols of government authority simultaneously. Thousands of fighters infiltrated urban centers where many believed they could ignite a popular uprising against the South Vietnamese government, while demonstrating that communist forces remained capable of operating anywhere in the country. From a purely military perspective, the offensive inflicted enormous losses on communist forces. Entire units were destroyed, experienced fighters were killed, and many objectives could not be held for long. Yet the campaign achieved something perhaps even more valuable than territorial conquest. It shattered confidence. Television audiences around the world watched scenes of fighting inside cities previously believed secure, including dramatic attacks in Saigon itself. Images contradicted years of optimistic official statements and forced politicians, journalists, and ordinary citizens to reconsider the trajectory of the war. The significance of the offensive extended far beyond Vietnam's border. It influenced elections in the United States, accelerated peace negotiations, altered military doctrine, demonstrated that perception can outweigh battlefield statistics. Historians continue to debate whether the offensive represented a tactical failure or a strategic masterpiece, but few dispute that it marked one of the defining turning points of the Cold War. Understanding the communist offensive requires examining not only the battles themselves but also their ideology, planning, logistics, intelligence operations, and political calculations that made such an audacious campaign possible. It was the product of years of preparations, immense sacrifices, and a willingness by communist leadership to accept extraordinary casualties in pursuit of long-term strategic objectives. The story is therefore not merely about combat but about how wars are ultimately won or lost through the interaction of military force, political will, public opinion, and national endurance. The communist offensive that changed the Vietnam War, strategy shock, and the road to Victory. Segment 1. Introduction. The day the war changed forever. History is often remembered through dates that appear ordinary until events transform them into turning points for entire civilizations. For the Vietnam War, one such moment arrived during the early hours of January 30th, 1968. Across South Vietnam, thousands of communist fighters emerged almost simultaneously from villages, jungles, hidden tunnels, and even cities themselves to launch one of the most ambitious military operations of the 20th century. What became known as the Tet Offensive was not merely another battle or campaign, but a coordinated national assault that fundamentally altered the political, military, and psychological landscape of the war. For years before the offensive, the United States government had maintained that the conflict was moving steadily towards victory. American commanders pointed to impressive body counts, successful search and destroy operations, expanding control over rural territories, and the growing capabilities of the Army of the Republic of Vietnam. Official briefings repeatedly suggested that the communist forces had been weakened and that their ability to conduct large-scale operations had been severely diminished. Many policymakers believed that while the war remained costly, the strategic momentum belonged to Washington and Saigon. The leadership in North Vietnam saw the situation very differently. They recognized that defeating the United States through conventional military superiority was unrealistic. American industrial capacity, air power, naval strength, and technological advantages were overwhelming. Instead, Hanoi strategy depended on exhausting its opponents politically rather than destroying it militarily. Victory would not come from conquering every battlefield, but from convincing the United States that the cost of continuing the war would exceed any possible benefit. Every military action, therefore, served a broader political objective. Every casualty was measured against long-term national survival. The Tet Offensive embodied this philosophy. Rather than concentrating forces in one region, communist planners sought to strike hundreds of targets across South Vietnam almost simultaneously. Provincial capitals, military headquarters, airfields, police stations, communication centers, government offices would all come under attack within hours of one another. Even Saigon, considered one of the most secure cities in the country, would witness fierce combat. The intention was not simply to seize territory, but to demonstrate that no place was beyond reach, and that South Vietnamese government could not guarantee security even in its own capital. Months of preparation preceded the offensive. Weapons were smuggled into urban areas through elaborate underground networks. Fighters disguised themselves as civilians and blended into local populations. Supply caches were hidden beneath homes, inside businesses, and along secret routes maintained through extraordinary discipline. The Ho Chi Minh Trail, stretching through neighboring countries, functioned as a logistical artery despite relentless American bombing campaigns. Thousands of porters, engineers, and soldiers kept supplies moving through mountains and jungles under conditions that would have broken less determined organizations. The timing itself reflected calculated symbolism. Tet, the Vietnamese Lunar New Year, traditionally represented family union, celebration, and temporary peace. Previous years had often included informal ceasefire as soldiers visited relatives and communities observed religious and cultural traditions. By launching their offensive during this holiday, communist leaders exploited expectations of reduced vigilance while maximizing psychological shock. The decision ensured that military surprise would be amplified by cultural surprise, multiplying confusion during the opening hours of the attack. When the attacks began, the scale exceeded almost every expectation. More than 100 cities and towns experienced coordinated attacks. American bases came under rocket fire. Government buildings were attacked. In Saigon, communist commandos penetrated the grounds of the United States Embassy, creating images that would circulate worldwide and symbolize the vulnerability of even the most heavily defended institutions. Although the attackers ultimately failed to occupy the embassy, and the mere fact that they had reached it carried enormous symbolic weight. Nowhere was the fighting more intense than in the ancient imperial city of Hue. There, communist forces managed to seize large portions of the city and hold them for weeks against determined counterattacks. Street by street, combat devastated historic neighborhoods, destroyed centuries-old architecture, and inflicted several casualties on both soldiers and civilians. The prolonged struggle demonstrated that the offensive was capable of generating sustained urban warfare rather than merely conducting hit-and-run tactics. Ironically, the offensive proved disastrous for communist forces in purely military terms. Casualties mounted into tens of thousands. Many experienced Viet Cong cadres who had spent years building underground networks in South Vietnam were killed or captured, rendered combat ineffective. Planned popular uprisings largely failed to materialize. Many objectives could not be held once American and South Vietnamese reinforcements responded. By conventional measurements of battlefield success, the offensive represented a costly setback. Yet, wars are rarely decided solely by casualty figures or maps. Images broadcast to television audiences in the United States contradicted official optimism and undermined public confidence in government assessments. If communist forces were supposedly near defeat, how could they launch attacks on such a massive scale across the entire country? This contradiction fueled skepticism among journalists, politicians, and ordinary citizens. Public support for continued escalation weakened, while entire anti-war sentiment gained momentum and strategic victory began shifting away from military statistics toward political perception. The consequences extended far beyond Vietnam itself. President Lyndon B. Johnson announced that he would not seek another term in office. Peace negotiations gained urgency, and American strategy gradually evolved towards reducing direct involvement while transferring greater responsibility to South Vietnamese forces. The conflict increasingly became a contest over endurance and legitimacy rather than territorial control alone. The Tet Offensive occupies a unique place in military history. It demonstrated that tactical defeat can coexist with strategic success and psychological impact may outweigh battlefield outcomes. The campaign revealed the limitations of measuring victory through conventional metrics when political will constitutes the true center of gravity. More importantly, it exposed the complex relationship between military operations, media coverage, public opinion, and national decision-making in modern warfare. To understand why this offensive altered the course of history, it is necessary to examine the decades of conflict, ideology, planning, and sacrifices that made such an extraordinary operation possible. The events of Tet didn't emerge suddenly from chaos, but it represented the culmination of years of preparations by leaders who believed that one carefully calculated gamble could reshape the destiny of Vietnam and force the world's most powerful nation to reconsider its commitment. Segment 2. Vietnam before Tet. Colonialism, division, and the seeds of conflict. Long before American helicopters filled the skies over Southeast Asia and decades before the Tet Offensive shocked the world, Vietnam had already endured generations of foreign domination, political upheaval, and national struggle. The Vietnam War didn't emerge suddenly from the tensions of the Cold War. Instead, it represented the latest chapter in a much older story of resistance, empire, nationalism, and competing visions for the country's future. To understand why the communist offensive of 1968 became possible, one must first understand the historical forces that shaped Vietnam itself. For centuries, Vietnam existed in the shadow of larger powers. Chinese dynasties repeatedly attempted to dominate this region, leaving deep cultural influences while simultaneously fostering a strong Vietnamese tradition of resistance. Throughout its history, Vietnam developed a powerful sense of national identity centered on survival against stronger foreign neighbors. This historical memory would later become a critical element in the struggle against both French colonial rule and American intervention. The 19th century brought a new challenge. As European imperialism expanded across Asia and Africa, France gradually established control over Vietnam, eventually incorporating it into French Indochina alongside Laos and Cambodia. French colonial authorities introduced modern infrastructure, railways, ports, and administrative institutions but these developments primarily served colonial interests rather than Vietnamese population. Economic resources flowed through French investors, while political power remained concentrated in foreign hands. Colonial rule transformed Vietnamese society in profound ways. Traditional elites lost influence, while new economic structure disrupted rural communities. Large landowners accumulated vast estates, leaving millions of peasants trapped in poverty and debt. Educational opportunities remained limited, and political dissent was often suppressed. While a small Vietnamese middle class emerged within colonial institutions, many intellectuals became increasingly frustrated by the contradiction of the French rule, which spoke of liberty equality while denying political rights to its colonial subjects. By the early 20th century, nationalist movements began to emerge. Some reformers sought gradual modernization and greater autonomy within the French Empire. Others advocated complete independence through revolutionary struggle. Among the many activists who entered politics during this period, one figure would eventually overshadow all others: Ho Chi Minh. Born Nguyen Si Kung in 1890, Ho Chi Minh spent years traveling abroad, observing colonial systems and studying revolutionary ideologies. During this time in Europe, he became increasingly attracted to Marxism-Leninism, which appeared to offer both a critique of imperialism and a strategy for national liberation. Unlike many Western communists, those whose primary concern was class struggle, Ho viewed communism as a vehicle for achieving Vietnamese independence. Nationalism and revolutionary socialism became inseparable components of his political vision. The outbreak of the Second World War dramatically altered the balance of power in Asia. Following the fall of France in 1940, Japanese forces occupied Indochina while allowing French colonial administrators to remain in place under supervision. Vietnam now found itself under dual domination, created new opportunities for resistance movements. During this period, Ho Chi Minh and his allies established the Viet Minh, a broad nationalist coalition dedicated to fighting foreign occupation and securing independence. The collapse of Japanese power in 1945 created a political vacuum. Seizing the moment, the Viet Minh launched the August Revolution and declared the independence of Democratic Republic of Vietnam in Hanoi. For a brief period, it appeared that Vietnam might emerge as a unified independent state. Ho Chi Minh even quoted principles from the American Declaration of Independence while announcing new government formations. These hopes quickly collided with international realities. France sought to re-establish its colonial authority, leading to negotiations that soon deteriorated into open conflict. The resulting First Indochina War lasted from 1946 until 1954 and became one of the most significant anti-colonial struggles of the 20th century. French forces possessed superior equipment, training, and resources, yet they faced an opponent motivated by nationalism and increasingly skilled in guerrilla warfare. Over the course of the war, the Viet Minh transformed from a relatively small revolutionary movement into a disciplined military organization. Under the leadership of General Vo Nguyen Giam, communist forces mastered the art of combining political mobilization with military operations. Villages became logistical hubs, civilians became intelligence networks, military campaigns became instruments of political education. Every aspect of society was gradually integrated into the broader struggle for independence. The decisive moment arrived in 1954 at the Battle of Dien Bien Phu. French commanders believed they could lure the Viet Minh into a conventional battle by establishing a heavily fortified base in a remote valley. Instead, Giap orchestrated one of the most remarkable military operations in modern history. Thousands of laborers dragged artillery pieces through mountains and jungles previously considered impassable. After months of preparation, the Viet Minh forces surrounded the French position and subjected it to relentless bombardment. The fortress eventually collapsed, delivering a humiliating defeat to France and signaling the end of its colonial ambitions in Indochina. The Geneva Conference later that year sought to establish a framework for peace. Vietnam was temporarily divided along the 17th parallel. The communist government controlled the north, while a separate administration emerged in the south. National elections were scheduled for 1956 to reunify the country, but those elections never occurred. Both sides suspected they would lose under unfavorable conditions. Cold War tension increasingly influenced the decision-making. The division of Vietnam created two rival states with fundamentally different political systems. In North Vietnam, Ho Chi Minh's government pursued socialist transformation and reformation, land reform, centralized planning, and the construction of communist state aligned with both the Soviet Union and China. In South Vietnam, President Ngo Dinh Diem established an anti-communist government supported by the United States. Washington viewed Vietnam through the lens of containment. American policymakers feared that a communist victory would trigger a chain reaction across Southeast Asia, a concept known as the domino theory. According to this logic, the fall of one nation to communism would encourage neighboring states to follow. Vietnam therefore became far more than a regional conflict. It evolved into a critical front in the global ideological struggle between communism and capitalism. The South Vietnamese government faced significant challenges from the beginning: political instability, corruption, even economic development, and tensions between urban elites and rural populations weakened its legitimacy. Many peasants remained dissatisfied with land ownership patterns and government policies. While some supported anti-communist state, others viewed it as disconnected from local realities. Communist organizers reorganized these weaknesses and began rebuilding underground networks throughout the South. Former Vietnamese members who had remained behind the partition quietly established cells, recruited supporters, and prepared for future conflict. Their efforts eventually contributed to the creation of National Liberation Front, known to its opponents as the Viet Cong. What appeared on the surface as a stable division between North and South concealed an increasingly tense struggle beneath. By the early 1960s, violence escalated dramatically. Assassinations, ambushes, sabotage operations, and counterinsurgency campaigns became common across rural Vietnam. American advisors arrived in growing numbers, military aid expanded, both sides became convinced that compromise was impossible. Each believed that the future of Vietnam depended upon total victory. The foundations of the Tet Offensive were being laid during these years. The communist movement learned how to organize clandestine networks, exploit political grievances, and sustain long-term warfare against stronger opponents. North Vietnam developed the institutions, logistical systems, and strategic culture necessary for prolonged conflict. Most importantly, its leaders became convinced that endurance and political will could overcome even the most formidable enemy in terms of military advantages. The Vietnam that entered the 1960s was therefore not merely a battleground of Cold War. It was a nation divided by ideology, shaped by colonial history, and driven by competing visions of independence and legitimacy. The struggle that began under French rule evolved into something larger, setting the stage for a conflict that would eventually draw in the world's greatest superpower, culminate in one of the most consequential offensives in modern military history. Segment 3. Building the Communist Revolution, Ho Chi Minh, the Viet Minh, and North Vietnam. The Communist Offensive of 1968 didn't emerge from improvisation or desperation. It was the product of decades of ideological commitment, organization discipline, and strategic planning that began long before American combat troops arrived in Vietnam. At the center of this transformation stood Ho Chi Minh, a revolutionary leader whose ability to fuse nationalism with communism created one of the most resilient political movements of the 20th century. The foundations laid by Ho and Viet Minh eventually enabled North Vietnam to challenge militarily superior opponents through patience, sacrifice, and carefully constructed institutions. Ho Chi Minh understood that military force alone could never secure lasting victory. Through his political career, he emphasized that revolutions succeeded only when political organization, social mobilization, and armed struggle reinforce one another. Every village, school, factory, and local committee should become part of revolutionary process. Rather than separating civilians from soldiers, the movement sought to integrate the entire population into a unified national effort. This philosophy distinguished the communist strategy from many conventional armies that depended upon professional military forces. The Viet Minh developed the struggle against Japanese occupation and French colonialism as far more than a guerrilla army. It became a nationwide political network capable of collecting intelligence, distributing propaganda, recruiting volunteers, administering territory, and maintaining logistical area and systems across difficult terrain. Local cadres often knew every family within their assigned villages, allowing them to identify potential supporters when monitoring individuals considered hostile to the movement. Information flowed upward through disciplined chain of commands, creating an organization that combined local knowledge with centralized direction. Military operations that reflected this political foundation. Rather than seeking decisive battles whenever possible, commanders focused on preserving strength while gradually exhausting their opponents. Small ambushes, sabotage missions, targeted assassinations, and attacks on isolated outposts imposed continuous cost without requiring direct confrontation against superior firepower. Every engagement was evaluated not only for tactical decisions but also for political consequences. Even defeats could become victories if they strengthened recruitment and weakened enemy morale. General Vo Nguyen Giam became the principal architect of this military doctrine. Although not formally trained as a career soldier in the traditional European sense, Giap possessed an exceptional ability to combine historical study with practical adaptation, influenced both influenced by both Maoist revolutionary warfare and Vietnam's own historical experiences resisting foreign invasion. He argued that weaker forces could defeat stronger enemies through prolonged struggle. Time itself could become a weapon. An opponent with greater resource might eventually lose the political willingness to continue the fight if victory remained elusive. After the Geneva Accords divided Vietnam in 1954, North Vietnam faced the immense challenge of construction. The government initiated superior superior land reforms designed to distribute property from large landowners to peasants and consolidate political support in rural areas. While these campaigns increased communist control, they also produced serious abuses, including wrongful accusations and executions that later forced the leadership to acknowledge mistakes and moderate certain policies. Despite these failures, the reforms fundamentally altered social structures and strengthened the state's influence over agricultural production. Industrial development became another priority. Although North Vietnam remained economically underdeveloped, assistance from the Soviet Union and China enabled the construction of factories, transportation infrastructure, electrical systems, and military industries. Engineers, technicians, and plant workers, alongside foreign advisors, to build an economy capable of sustaining prolonged warfare. The objective was not immediate prosperity, but strategic endurance. Every bridge repaired, every workshop expanded, and every railway restored increased the nation's capacity to resist external pressure. Education, political indoctrination also occupied central positions within the revolutionary project. School emphasized patriotism, anti-colonial history, and socialist ideology, while encouraging students to view personal sacrifice as essential to national liberalization. Literacy campaigns reached rural populations that had previously received little formal education. Newspapers, radio broadcasts, cultural performance, and local meetings reinforced the message that the struggle against foreign influence required participation from every citizen regardless of occupation or age. The Communist Party established itself as the ultimate coordinating institution across every level of society. Provincial committees supervised regional administration while village cadres implemented policies at a local level. This structure ensured remarkable organizational cohesion despite frequent disruptions caused by war. Orders could travel from Hanoi to remote jungle districts through networks that combined political loyalties with administrative efficiency. The system later facilitated the enormous logistical coordination required for nationwide offensive. As tensions with South Vietnam intensified, North Vietnamese leaders faced difficult strategic choices. Some favored concentrating on economic development while avoiding premature military escalations. Others argued that reunification required active support for revolutionary forces in the South before anti-communist institutions became too entrenched. Gradually, the latter position prevailed. Hanoi concluded that political opportunities existed among dissatisfied rural populations and that delaying action might strengthen the South Vietnamese government beyond recovery. Supporting insurgency in the South required an extraordinary logistical achievement. The Ho Chi Minh Trail, despite its name, was not a single road, but an expanding network of paths, roads, bridges, pipelines, storage areas, concealed facilities extending through Laos and Cambodia. Thousands of laborers maintained the routes under constant threat from aerial bombardment. Bicycles reinforced with wooden supports carried loads weighing several hundred kilograms. Human porters crossed mountains with ammunition, medicine, food, and communications equipment. Engineers rebuilt destroyed villages overnight and diverted traffic wherever bombing damaged key sections. The trail became the circulatory system of communist war effort. Every rifle delivered, every replacement soldier transported, every radio battery supplied strengthened the insurgency in South Vietnam. American bombing campaigns destroyed enormous quantities of material, inflicted several casualties, yet the network proved remarkably adaptable. Rather than relying upon centralized infrastructure vulnerable to precision attack, it evolved into a decentralized system capable of rerouting supplies through multiple alternative paths. Simultaneously, communist intelligence organizations expanded their reach inside South Vietnam. Sympathizers infiltrated government offices, military organizations, transportation services, and urban communities. Information regarding troop movements, construction projects, security procedures, and political developments flowed back through covert channels. This intelligence capability would later prove indispensable during preparations for the Tet Offensive. When detailed knowledge of local conditions determined operational planning by the mid-1960s, North Vietnam had effectively transformed itself into a society organized around permanent mobilization. Farmers harvested crops while expecting periodic military service. Students prepared academically while anticipating future deployment. Factory workers produced civilian goods alongside military equipment. Families accepted prolonged separations as relatives disappeared into training camps or supply routes extending towards the south. The distinction between civilian life and wartime responsibility steadily diminished. Perhaps the most significant achievement of the revolutionary leadership was psychological rather than material. Through years of propaganda, education, and lived experiences, the government cultivated an acceptation that victory would require immense sacrifice, but remained historically inevitable. Casualty, destructions, and economic hardships were presented as temporary burdens in the destruction and economic hardship were presented as temporary burdens in the larger national struggle that stretched back centuries against foreign domination. This narrative provided resilience even during periods of several severe military losses. In 1967, the institution built over decades had matured into an apparatus capable of supporting operations on a scale unimaginable during the anti-French struggle. Political networks extended beyond both North and South Vietnam. Logistical systems sustained continuous infiltration despite overwhelming American firepower. Military units possessed combat experience accumulated over years of guerrilla warfare and conventional engagements. Intelligence organizations maintained contacts inside major cities. Above all, the leadership believed that one sufficiently dramatic offensive might fundamentally alter the political dynamics of the war. The communist revolution had therefore evolved from a movement seeking independence into a highly organized state pursuing reunification through coordinated military and political strategy. Its strength didn't rest solely upon coordinated military and political strategy. Its strength Those institutions would soon be tested in the most ambitious operation North Vietnam had ever attempted. As planners prepared to carry the war from remote jungles directly into streets of South Vietnam cities. Segment 4. The rise of Viet Cong, guerrilla warfare in the South. When Vietnam was divided at the 17th parallel in 1954, the separation was officially described as temporary. The Geneva Accords envisioned nationwide elections that would unify the country, but those elections never took place. Instead, the line hardened into a political frontier that divided not only territory, but competing visions of Vietnam's future. While North consolidated a communist state under Ho Chi Minh, the South attempted to build an anti-communist republic under President Ngo Diem. Beneath the surface of this political division, however, thousands of communist supporters remained scattered across the countryside, waiting for instruction that would eventually reshape the conflict. Many veterans of the Viet Minh who had fought against the French relocated north after the Geneva settlement, but not all departed. A significant number stayed behind deliberately, bending back into civilian life while maintaining clandestine connections with communist organizers. Some returned to farming, others became teachers, merchants, laborers, or village officials. Yet, many quietly preserved hidden weapons, secret communication channels, and trusted relationships that could be activated years later. These dormant networks formed the foundation of the insurgency that would emerge during the late 1950s. At first, Hanoi pursued caution. Rebuilding North Vietnam after years of war required enormous resources, and direct confrontation with the South risked provoking foreign intervention. Communist leaders therefore concentrated on political organization rather than immediate military escalation. Underground cadres spread propaganda, recruited sympathizers, and gathered intelligence and exploited local grievances without launching major military campaigns. The objective was to create a resilient political infrastructure before expanding armed resistance. Conditions in South Vietnam increasingly favored such efforts. President Diem sought to centralize authority and suppress communist influence, but this government faced criticism from multiple directions. Land ownership remained unequal despite reform promises, corruption undermined administrative effectiveness, and many rural communities viewed officials as distant representatives of urban elites rather than protectors of local interests. Religious tensions, forced relocations, and unpopular security measures further alienated portions of the population. One of the most controversial One of the most controversial initiatives involved the Strategic Hamlet Program. Designed with American support, it sought to isolate rural populations from communist influence by relocating villages into fortified settlements surrounded by fences, watchtowers, and defensive positions. In theory, the program would protect civilians from denying guerrilla access to recruits and supplies. In practice, implementation often proved rushed and coercive. Families were moved from ancestral lands, traditional community structures were disrupted, and promised security frequently failed to materialize. In many areas, resentment generated by relocation outweighed any strategic benefits. Communist organizers capitalized on these frustrations with remarkable effectiveness. Rather than relying solely on ideological appeals, they tailored their message to local circumstances. To impoverished farmers, they promised land distribution. To nationalists, they emphasized resistance against foreign influence. To families affected by government abuses, they presented themselves as the defenders of justice. This flexibility allowed the movement to attract supporters whose motivations ranged from communist conviction to simple dissatisfaction with the existing conditions. In December 1960, various anti-government groups formally united under the National Liberation Front, the NLF, commonly abbreviated as the NLF. The South Vietnamese government and the United States referred to its armed member as the Viet Cong, a shortened form of Vietnamese communists. Although many participants were genuine Southerns with local grievances, Hanoi increasingly exercised strategic influence over the organization, providing leadership, training, weapons, and logistical support while portraying the movement as an indigenous uprising against the Saigon government. The Viet Cong developed a style of warfare fundamentally different from conventional military operations. Rather than attempting to hold territory permanently or defeat enemy divisions in open battle, they emphasized mobility, surprise, and political influence. Small units could disappear into forests, rice paddies, swamps, or sympathetic villages after completing attacks. Ambushes targeted isolated patrols, bridges were demolished at night, communication lines were severed. Government officials considered especially effective or unpopular might be assassinated in carefully planned operations, designed to intimidate opponents while demonstrating the reach of the insurgency. Tunnels became one of the most famous symbols of Viet Cong ingenuity. Across parts of South Vietnam, especially around Ho Chi near Saigon, underground networks expanded into astonishingly sophisticated complexes. Hidden entrances concealed hospitals, ammunition depots, kitchens, sleeping quarters, and command centers, and escape routes. Some systems extended for hundreds of kilometers through interconnected chambers largely built on hand. Ventilation shafts disguised as termite mounds allowed occupants to survive underground while avoiding aerial detection. American forces frequently discovered that areas appearing peaceful on the surface concealed entire military infrastructure beneath their feet. The guerrillas also exploited intimate knowledge of local geography. Dense jungles, mangrove swamps, mountain trails, and irrigation canals provided concealment against technologically superior opponents. Simple traps made from sharpened bamboo stakes, concealed peats, and repurposed unexploded ordnance imposed psychological as well as physical costs. Soldiers moving through unfamiliar terrain faced constant uncertainty, knowing that every path might conceal danger. Such conditions eroded confidence and forced heavily equipped units to advance cautiously through environments where mobility itself became a liability. Equally important was the Viet Cong's political organization at the village level. Cadres established shadow governments capable of collecting taxes, administering justice, recruiting labor, and distributing propaganda. In some regions, communist influence operated openly after dark while government authority returned during daylight hours. Villagers often navigated between both systems simply to survive, cooperating with whichever side held immediate power while trying to avoid retaliation from the other. The resulting ambiguity complicated intelligence gathering and blurred distinction between combatants and civilians. American military doctrine initially struggled to address this form of warfare. Superior firepower could destroy enemy formations once located, but locating them consistently proved extraordinarily difficult. Helicopters enabled rapid deployment, artillery provided overwhelming destructive capacity, and Aircraft dominated the skies, yet these advantages depended upon identifying targets that deliberately avoided direct confrontation. Large search and destroy operations sometimes inflicted severe casualties on guerrilla units, but surviving fighters often dispersed into surrounding communities before regrouping elsewhere. The Viet Cong accepted casualties as part of a broader strategy of attrition. Their objective was not necessarily to win every engagement, but to impose continuous costs while demonstrating persistence. Every patrol required resources, every convoy demanded protection, every village had to secure repeatedly rather than once. Over time, the cumulative burden sustained both military planning and political patience. Communist leaders believed that a wealthy democracy fighting far from home might eventually tire of an apparently endless conflict, even if the battlefield victories accumulate.